From the thick mud of African trails to the red dust of the Australian outback, and finally to the gates of Buckingham Palace, the Defender has journeyed across worlds. Now adorned in luxury, one question echoes through its storied history. Has it preserved the soul that built its legend, or become something entirely new? In the years after the Second World War, late 1940s Britain was running on grit and tea. Steel was scarce, bread was rationed, and in the countryside, farmers faced a peculiar problem. They needed a machine that could plow a field in the morning, then get them to the village pub without looking like they'd just driven a tank. Across the ocean, surplus American Jeeps, battle-tested in the early 1940s, had proven that a simple, rugged design could cross rivers, climb hills, and still find a parking spot in town. Maurice Wilkes, Rover's chief designer, saw one on his farm and began to think, what if Britain had its own? One breezy afternoon on a beach in Anglesey, Maurice called over his brother Spencer, the company's managing director. With the tide creeping in, he sketched his vision right in the sand. A tough, go-anywhere workhorse for farmers and townsfolk alike. A vehicle that could tow hay bales, haul fence posts, and yes, still make it to Sunday service without scandal. By April 1948, that sandy sketch became the Land Rover Series 1. It wore an aluminum body to save precious steel and resist rust, a ladder-frame chassis tough enough for farm work, and permanent four-wheel drive for those glorious British mud seasons. Farmers swore by it. Villagers called it a tractor you could drive to church, and soon it was as common in the countryside as sheep and rain. No one knew it yet, but this humble green machine had just begun its climb from muddy tracks to royal driveways, and eventually to legend. It did not take long for the Land Rover to wander far from British hedgerows. By the early 1950s, word of its toughness spread faster than a campfire rumor, and soon it was working in places that made the Yorkshire Dales look like a picnic spot. In 1960s Africa, it became the unofficial animal in every safari convoy. It carried wildlife guides, bush doctors, and aid workers across sun-bleached savannas, through crocodile-infested rivers, and into villages so remote even the maps looked uncertain. Other vehicles turned back. The Land Rover pressed on. By the 1970s, in Australia it earned its keep on cattle stations the size of small countries. It herded cattle across dusty plains, hauled supplies where no road dared to exist, and when floods swallowed towns whole, it was often a Land Rover that brought food, medicine, and the stranded to safety. Then came the Middle East, where the sun burned like a furnace and sand could swallow a man by the ankle in seconds. Oil fields, border patrols, and dunes that even camels reconsidered. The Land Rover tackled them all without complaint. In all these places, it was never just a vehicle. It was a steel handshake that promised, "I'll get you there." Communities wove it into their stories, and in return, it stood by them through good seasons and bad. By now, the Defender's roots were global, and wherever it went, carried not just cargo, but the unshakable trust of those who relied on it. From the 1950s onward, in the rolling green hills of Balmoral Estate, the quiet was often broken by a familiar rumble. It was the sound of a Land Rover, but not just any Land Rover. Behind the wheel sat Queen Elizabeth II herself. No chauffeur, no fanfare, just a determined smile beneath her trusty headscarf. She looked less like a monarch and more like someone who knew exactly where she was headed, muddy tracks and all. One day, this same vehicle hauled hay bales for hard-working farmers. The next, it splashed through puddles on royal grounds, ready to carry guests with polished seats instead of sacks of grain. Could a machine be both mud-streaked workhorse and polished royal chariot? The Defender pulled it off with quiet dignity. This unlikely mix is where its true magic lived. It was just as at home alongside red deer grazing the hills as it was parked beside visiting world leaders. The Defender was never chosen for fancy leather or glitzy trim. It was chosen because it could be trusted, no questions asked. And at the Balmoral, that mattered more than any sparkling paint job. To the public, these moments offered something rare, a glimpse of connection between monarch and citizen. Whether in muddy boots or elegant coats, countless people shared a ride in the same vehicle. In that blend of grit and grace, the Defender grew beyond transport. It became a moving symbol, a piece of Britain itself. For over 6 decades, from 1948 through the early 2010s, the old Defender was more than just a vehicle. It was a way of life, a stubborn companion that gave as much as it demanded. Its charm lay not in what it offered, but in what it proudly left out. Under the bonnet, the engine was simple enough that a determined owner could fix it with just basic tools. Out in the middle of nowhere, a quick field repair can mean the difference between a warm bed and a night under the stars. That rugged, fix-anywhere spirit was deeply woven deep into its legend. The shape was proudly square, a boxy silhouette that shouted function over fashion. Inside, upright seats gave a clear view of every bump and turn ahead, while the body hummed and rattled with each mile. Those drafts sneaking through the door seals? Purists didn't see them as flaws, they were part of the Defender's personality. Every creak and shiver was a reminder this machine was built to work hard, not to whisper sweet nothings. Luxury was never the goal. There were no soft seats or quiet cabins, only tough materials made to last a lifetime. Mud on the floor was a badge of honor, scratches on the paint told stories, and every dent held a memory. Owners often talked about these quirks with a grin, like they were describing a stubborn old friend who refused to change. To those who loved it, the old Defender was perfect because it never tried to be anything else. In a world full of sleek designs and glowing screens, it stayed proudly mechanical, always ready to get its wheels dirty. By the early 2010s, the world had changed faster than the Defender could keep up. New safety rules demanded armor around passengers, and emissions laws whispered, "Clean up or step aside." The old design, beloved for its no-nonsense simplicity, faced a harsh truth. To survive, it would have to change so much it might lose the soul that made it legendary. Then came January 29, 2016. The last original Defender rolled off the Solihull line. No cheers, no royal fanfare, just quiet hands, eyes full of pride, and a touch of sadness. Some workers reached out, running their fingers across the worn metal, as if saying a silent goodbye to a friend who had carried them through decades of muddy fields and city streets. For fans and owners worldwide, it felt like a family album closing. Nearly 7 decades of memories, adventures, and hard work were coming to an end. The news hit hard. No more Defenders would ever roll out in their original form. And suddenly, the once common Land Rover became a rare treasure. Prices jumped as collectors scrambled to grab a piece of history. People spoke of their Defenders like old friends, reliable, rough around the edges, and full of stories. This was more than the end of a production line. It marked the close of an era when vehicles were built for endurance first and appearance second, when loyalty was earned through grit. The Defender had reached the finish line of its first journey. What came next? That story was still waiting to be told. In 2020, the Defender came back, but not as a blast from the past. It arrived as something completely new, sleek, tech-packed, and aimed at a broader audience. Gone were the rows of mechanical switches. Now, screens lit up the dashboard, and driver aids promised to take some of the guesswork out of adventure. On paper, its off-road skills looked just as strong, with smart suspension and terrain modes ready to tackle the wild. For some, this was a thrilling evolution. The Defender was finally ready for a world of tougher rules and new expectations. Urban buyers, influencers, and luxury seekers rushed to own a piece of history that doubled as a style statement. But for purists, this was a tougher pill to swallow. They remembered a Defender you could fix with a spanner in a muddy field, not one that needed specialist tools and software just to start. To them, the soul of the Defender lived in its simplicity, and adding layers of electronics risked burying that heart. Forums and clubs buzzed with debate. Some praised the comfort, safety, and tech that opened doors to fresh audiences. Others insisted it had become something else entirely, a luxury SUV hiding behind a familiar badge. Yet, beneath the arguments lay one truth: the Defender still mattered. Whether celebrated or criticized, it continued to inspire passion, proof that its story was far from finished. Today, more than 75 years after that first 1948 model, the Defender lives 2 very different lives. In rural Africa, restored originals still hum along familiar dirt tracks under the relentless sun. They carry water, medical supplies, and people across miles of rough terrain. Their engines rumble with steady purpose, while repairs happen under the shade of trees, using tools handed down through generations. Meanwhile, in cities like London and Sydney, A different kind of Defender gleams under shopfront lights and glass towers. These modern machines glide through traffic, their polished interiors reflecting city skylines. Owners park them outside cafes and offices, proud to show off a vehicle that mixes heritage with style. Though their designs and purposes have diverged, both Defenders carry the same name. Together, they prove an icon can adapt without losing its identity. One remains a tireless workhorse in remote lands. The other is a symbol of success, ready for weekend getaways or city streets. The Defender has always been more than metal and wheels. It has become a partner, a trusted tool, and now a statement. In both old and new forms, it mirrors how human values have shifted. Where survival and endurance once reigned, today image and comfort often share the spotlight. The story of the Defender is the story of change itself. It reminds us that heritage can endure, even as the world transforms around it. So, which Defender wins your heart? The mud-streaked legend or the high-tech icon? Tell us in the comments. And if you love stories where history meets horsepower, subscribe to AutoVault.